on my social media, I've received a question: the distinction between brain, mind, consciousness. Ooh, that's a murky one. I think the greatest neuroscientists, the greatest philosophers, the greatest thinkers, the greatest moralists, moral theorists have tried to make a distinctions between these. I'll do my best here in this short 5 minutes or so. We have what is called the soft problem and the hard problem in neurology and neuroscience describing consciousness. And we have a tremendous amount of reflexes in our brain, and they become more sophisticated and highly refined as you go up into the cortex, and maybe down in the spinal cord, they're very primitive and basic. So we can have what is called a monosynaptic reflex, where you have a stimulus, somebody hits a hammer on your knee, and then you have a response. There's not a lot of thought involved. It's just quick response. It's a reflex. But then you can also have disynaptic and trisynaptic and quaternary synaptic and pentanary synaptic. And the more the number of neurons and interneurons between the stimulus and the response, the sensory and the motor response, the more we like to think of it as complex reflexes. And now we start to think, well, there's some sort of mental involvement in the stimulus response. And so the greater the number of neurons, as you go up in the brain, there's billions of neurons, the greater the number of neurons responding, the more we give a mental faculty and not just a neurological correlate. And so science is basically trying to create the neural correlations between stimulus and response. And if we do, we give more mental weight to it. But it's just a physical response and it's a neurological reflex. But as we get more and more interneurons, it becomes more of a processing, and we kind of call it the mind or conscious response. So the greater the number of neurons, the more the associations we make, and the more we tend to think of as a mental response. We have, instead of just a synaptic reflex, it's now reflected. We reflected on it. We brought in other associations from previous subconscious stored information and imagination, and we've come up with all kinds of different ways of associating that. We've got a primary sensory cortex. Let's say we take in information from our eyes. We have a primary visual cortex, V1, and then we've got the visual associative areas all the way to V5 and V6. The more the associations, the more we bring to the table mental faculties instead of just a response. If we see a spider and we respond in a billionth of a second through the spinal tectal tract and the superior colliculi in our brain, that reflex is very quick, within 200 milliseconds, and we'll respond. We didn't do a lot of thinking about it. We just got the heck out of there. The spider jumped us. The snake came after us. We avoided because of an amygdala response and a reflex. But if we stop and reflect, and is this a coral snake? What kind of spider is this? Is it really harmful? The more knowledge we have, the more we'll look at the spider and not react, and therefore more mental faculties, more conscious awareness. If we're very ignorant and we are in a total reflex and we respond immediately in systems one thinking, we have just a brain, we have a neural correlate, we have a response, we can measure it, we can see it. You're not much of a thought. It's kind of like an automaton reacting. You're not even, you don't really have a free will. You're just having a response before you even thought consciously. The response occurred before it even got to the conscious level of the brain, into the cortex. So we don't call it a mental fact. We really call it a kind of a mental processing, low mental process, more neurological reflex. If we go up in there and we now have cognition on it, we think about it, we have a slow cognition, systems two thinking. We're processing it with our medial prefrontal cortex. We're now, consciously aware of all the pros and cons and the variables and associations. We now call it mental processing. The neural correlates, the medial prefrontal cortex, the cortical response, the associative areas in the brain, and now we have mental faculties. We're using our mental faculties and not our emotional reactions. So there's gradations, but we haven't ever completely got a perfect science yet between stimulus and response and everything. So we have what's called the hard problem. The hard problem is that we haven't been able to identify in neural correlations all the subjective experiences that we have. So this is something that some Materialists have promissory materialism think that we will someday unfold and figure out. Others think, no, we will not figure that out. I can't say one way or the other on whether we will or not. I think right now we just don't. So we have what is called the hard problem. So we basically say that there's a brain, there's reflexes, and some of those things we can identify. Then they become so complex that they're hard to identify, but they're probably mental functions and different levels of conscious awareness. When we study propranolol, we look at unconscious stimuli from anesthesia. We can see which ones are coming on board and which ones are not. So there's gradations there. Probably in the decades to come, we'll have more close understanding of how these reflexes that we thought were just reflexes are now thought through. But some believe that materialists believe that there is no mind. It's just reflexes in a brain. Okay, I'm okay with that. Others think that because we haven't got it solved yet and there's still a mystery associated with it, we'll call it a mind and we'll call it consciousness. Others are panpsychics that believe that there's nothing but mind and the brain is simply a mediation of the mind, and our mental faculty is an individuation of a brain that's mediating a panpsychic experience called intelligence. And this, even Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize winner, constructed that there was one mind. It's a panpsychism. Whitehead did the same thing, even Freeman Dyson. Many of these individuals believe that there was just one mind, and we're participating in a field of mind. I can give you all the different theories. I can give you all the different writings. I can give you different opinions, but I can't pin down this is the fact of all of it. We have some facts on reflexes, and we have some areas that we just don't know. They're mystery of the mind at this point, or mystery of consciousness. So whether it's all part of the brain, don't know yet. Whether it is field and our brain is a field mediator, there's evidence of that. There's evidence for all these different models. I don't have the answer to all that yet. I've been researching it for 52 years and still learning as I go. So don't know if I can answer that fully. Can't give you an absolute fact that you may want, but I can just give you that feedback for this 5-minute presentation.